right, let me figure out what's happening here. Nope, don't want that. No, don't want that. What are we doing here? Airplay.
You got your back to us, I want to say something.
All right.
I was very disgusted with you this morning.
With TV this morning?
Yeah.
Okay, Miss Jeanette, what's up?
Some little groups want donations for pride and love.
Okay.
And I just thought we needed Jesus' love content.
Well, I'm going to agree with you there. So let's say our prayers in our world today. Yes, ma'am. All right, we have been looking at this fall. Thank you, Miss Jeanette. The fall of Babylon, and we're here in the midst of the things of the end and a picture that's painted, where Babylon, i.e., Rome of the first century, is this pinnacle of world empire that stands contrasted to all things God, and judgment has come due for various sins. We've studied some of these along the way. We began by looking at these 7 incredible churches. Some were struggling with elements of the world. Some were holding fast to faithfulness. Some were good in some areas, but struggling in others. I think that echoes the issues that happen within churches over time. But ultimately, those things that stand against God, that stand against God's people, have to come before God and are judged. And that's where we're at. These pictures of these 7 bowls in the end in chapter 16, and then here this fall told in a particular way in chapters 17 and 18. And so we've looked at these first 8 verses, and we've seen this fallen Babylon, and we've seen these contrasts. And just to paint a very quick picture, what we have here is a picture of a place that is opposite of the Garden of Eden. We see that in the first few verses. But the downfall that's pictured here is actually taken from pictures of history that have already occurred. The city of Tyre and the city of Babylon itself in the Babylonian Empire of the Old Testament. And you can see that in Isaiah and in Jeremiah, Ezekiel specifically. I believe in chapters, finding my notes, chapters 26 through 28, Isaiah 23 for Tyre. And then for Babylon, Isaiah 13, 14, 47, Jeremiah 25, 50 and 51. These images are drawn from these falls that have already happened in history, that are painting the picture of what God's judgment is like, and here we are. And so one of the things that we've seen is this call, verse 4, to come out of Babylon. A call again of the people of God to be faithful and to endure. And again, we see just this picture of the goddess Roma painted as this harlot, right? But at the end of the day, the idea of harlotry, right, of prostitution is getting paid. And so it's a wonder that what's found in verses 9 through 19 are the laments of this fall. So this fall is occurring. God's people are called out. We see the judgment that's coming, but notice who cries. And notice what they cry over. So if you want to follow along, let's start in verse 9. And the kings of the earth who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning, and they will stand far off in fear of her torment and say, Alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city, Babylon. For in a single hour your judgment has come. And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore, cargo of gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth, silk, scarlet cloth, all kinds of scented wood, all kinds of articles of ivory, all kinds of articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle, sheep, and horses, and chariots, and slaves, that is, human souls. The fruit for which your soul longed has gone from you, and all your delicacies and your splendors are lost to you, never to be found again. And the merchants of these wares who gained wealth from her will stand far off in fear of her torment, weeping and mourning aloud, Alas, alas, for the great city that was clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, with jewels, and with pearls, for in a single hour all this wealth has been laid waste. And all the shipmasters and seafaring men, sailors, and all whose trade is on the sea stood far off and cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning. What city is like the great city? And they threw dust on their heads as they wept and mourned, crying out, Alas, alas, for the great city, where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth, for in a single hour she has been laid waste. There are three laments that are given in our text over this fall. A repetition that's being employed by three different classes of people. And notice what they're crying over. Rome's economic downfall. Chapter 18, verse 20 matches the glory given by the three classes of people. And we'll get to that rejoicing here maybe today. We may have to save that and roll into chapter 19 of the rejoicing that's found at the beginning of that chapter there. But mourning is done from a distance. Did you notice the kings of the earth, the merchants, and the seafarers stand afar off? If you think they're going to saddle their wagons to literally a sinking ship, you're crazy. A lot said about empire in these words. First crew is you see the kings of the earth in verses 9 and 10. These local rulers who benefit from the empire's prosperity and power by sharing in her luxury. You want to be friends, don't you, with the power? Don't we see that in the world today? People cozying up to other world leaders. I mean, isn't that what dominates the news? There's three great countries. It seems like I don't get political, but I do know what's up, I think. There are three great countries in the world today, and everybody's saddling with one of them. United States, Russia, China. Let's divide up the world. Who do people think is going to win? That's the side they want to be on. The kings of the earth want to saddle up to those who are strong in winning. By the way, the city of Tyre, economically prosperous. Ezekiel 27:33. When your wages came from the sea, you satisfied many peoples. With your abundant wealth and merchandise, you enriched the kings of the earth. You see here this sexual immorality and this living in luxury. Could that have been literal sexual sin? Maybe. Could that have been a figure of idolatry? Possibly as well, since that's most often the form that idolatry is spoken of in the Old Testament and even in Revelation. But if you notice, weep and wail. What was proclaimed by Rome about her glory is going to be part of her downfall. Here was this place rich and luxurious. People are going to cry when it falls. But notice the kings stand afar off. They're not going down to the sinking ship. But notice who gets the biggest amount of run, you might say, in this text. And that is the merchants that help make it all possible. Together with the king show the immense power that the merchant class had over empire. By the way, do billionaires have any influence over our government? Yeah. Is there anything new under the sun? Kingship and commerce. Whether it was the British East India Trading Company or the United States Military Industrial Complex. Yeah, I said that out loud. Who's pulling the strings? Who's calling the shots? Ask any investigator in a murder. One of the first questions I ask, I've seen enough shows. What is it? Follow the money. It's a spouse or follow the money. So saith Lifetime. Okay? Sorry, man, serious. I'm sitting here waxing about the brokenness of all. Got smiles behind us. I love it. Verse 11, no one there buys cargo anymore. Present tense reality for the future judgment. And if you notice in these verses, right? If you notice in these verses, there are 28 items that are listed. And you can almost break them down into various categories. We'll get there here in just a second. But if you think about it, these 28 items echo Ezekiel 27, where there are 40 items listed there. But here the focus is on what Rome specialized the most in. And so I'll try to break these down and give you a little historical context quickly. You had precious metals and jewels. Gold and silver was mined in Spain. Jewels and pearls imported from India. Lower quality pearls, by the way, would come from the Red Sea. By the way, it was said that Roman women loved pearls, and their value was slightly below diamonds in the Roman Empire. When you had copper and tin and Welsh gold, were the reasons, by the way, Claudius invaded Britannia. You think the Romans conquered territory for giggles? No. You want that place because of what that place has. Nothing's ever changed. And even in our world today, fill in your conflict of the moment and why. Number 2, cloth and textiles. Provinces of Asia specialize in expensive cloth. Remember those 7 churches? Remember some of the aspects, especially in Laodicea? Right? You're naked and you're pitiable and you're blind, even though that church in Laodicea produced some of the finest, right, cloth. And so here you see the exact same thing. By the way, Egyptian linen back then, very popular. You like your sheets today? So did the Romans 2,000 years ago. And Chinese silk. Then you find materials of wood and metal. Augustus, whether or not he thought himself emperor, was kind of made one, and the promise later had a wonderful line when it came to the materials of wood and metal. He said, I came to Rome in brick and I left it in marble. I came to Rome in brick and I left it in marble. Materials come all throughout the empire. Syrian ivory came from elephants. African ebony. Corinthian bronze. Iron from Spain and Pontus. By the way, building and military hardware. Marble from Africa, Egypt, and Greece. Then you have spices and perfumes. Cinnamon from India. Ceylon, which is Sri Lanka. Incense from all over the east. Myrrh from Mesopotamia. Frankincense from southern Arabia. Then you have food. You have wines. Of course, grapes from all over the empire. Sometimes more abundant than wheat. Remember Revelation 6:6? The wheat was expensive. The wine was cheap. By the way, one of the things that I found here that I thought was pretty incredible was wheat. It was important and imported from the northern coast of Africa and the Balkans. By the way, it was said that citizens of Rome got a free portion of wheat, while those in the empire had to face the inflationary prices that might result from crops being spared. You mean let's give out free food to the rich folks? But if you were in Rome, you got to go to the grocery store and get your allotment of free stuff. Sounds familiar in the world today of what people are trying to do, while other people may have to pay that price. Fascinating. And then you have olive oil from all over the empire, especially from Spain and Africa. By the way, supposedly there was once a 35-meter tall hill from just all the empty containers of olive oil outside of Rome. There was a literal hill of just broken vessels. That's how much olive oil was consumed in that place. It had to come from somewhere. Pretty amazing when you think about it. Cattle and sheep, of course, from all over, but notice the very last one, the kicker. You have bodies, i.e. slaves. By the way, they were often called just bodies in the Roman Empire so that their humanity wasn't emphasized. By the way, 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 10 has a special class for sinners. Did you notice? Enslavers. Those who purposefully went out to enslave others. Christians, not your business. And then do you notice, in light of the Roman Empire calling the slaves just bodies to demean their humanity, what John does to help plant a seed within his church in their mind? Do you notice what he says after that? What does he say? What does he call them? John says, you don't get to rewrite the narrative. You don't get to demean those made in the image of God in any way. You might call them just bodies. But I'm reminding you they're souls, human souls. That's powerful when you stop and think about a little line like that in its context. These weren't commodities to be bought and sold and traded. It's one thing to have a mountain of vessels of olive oil. It's another thing to kill a slave and just toss him aside and go out and get you another one like it's nothing. Now, chattel slavery in America was very different than Roman slavery. But y'all don't somehow let some aspects of history paint over that while some aspects of slavery were nowhere near as bad as what we might find in the American South, there are more than enough stories, one in particular of a Roman merchant or a Roman wealthy man whose son came to him and was talking about all the military things that he had seen. And he told his dad he had never seen a man die, so the father brought in a slave and killed him right in front of him and tossed the body aside. And by the way, there was no recourse or penalty for that. That was that man's property. That was rare, but it occurred. And you think of the gladiators and the slaves and the money that was made off of those aspects, right? If you ever saw that movie, Russell Crowe, very historically accurate in a lot of ways, by the way, if you remember that Russell Crowe movie, Gladiator. But it's incredible that that's how they were treated. Here, John says that's not how we're going to think. By the way, the slaves who mined and collected those other goods often were death sentences. You go into a copper mine, you don't live long in the ancient world. You start mining for diamonds. Even, by the way, you can go into some of the blood diamond stuff in Africa now. By the way, again, I can't recommend it for its language, but if you want to know an interesting, like historically accurate modern representation, Leonardo DiCaprio did a movie called Blood Diamond about 15, 20 years ago. And it's a really good movie, but it actually tells you much about where your diamonds come from. And it'll shock the living daylights out of it, because that still goes on in the world today in a lot of those countries. I just say that. But gold and silver and silk are not made in the image of God, so don't treat them as more valuable than other people. By the way, I don't recommend that movie. It's not exactly like, Disney friendly. But if you just want just the reality, I just recall that off the top of my head, seeing that years ago, and it's like, well, if you can maybe edit out some of it, what's said there and what's shown there is a very real thing in aspects of the world. But more than just what would be filled in shops of small town USA, right? Are you listening? All these goods pointed to the opulence and luxury of Rome, the capital, by the way, of any empire. Look at the great cities of the world. And boy, they are elevated that way. And in verse 14, this is John's commentary showing through. Verse 14, the fruit for which your soul longed has gone from you, and all your delicacies and your splendors are lost to you, never to be found again. Like 12:8 with the dragon's expulsion from heaven, here you thought all these things, and you thought you would always have these things. No more. And then in verses 15 through 17, like the kings, the merchants stand in a distance, and they mourn the downfall. Where Babylon and Rome made a desolation of other nations, now they too will become desolate. By the way, one of the things that helps us, a key to interpretation, is what perspective do I have? John's in verse 14 are the merchants in 15 through 17. For one, it was an affront to God and His creation to be eat up with that materialism. To the other, it was a loss to their pocketbook and lifestyle. Now, Barry's not telling you not to save. Barry's not telling you not to plan for retirement. I'm saving. I'm trying to plan for my retirement, Lord willing, one of these days. But this is one of those humble reminders that causes us, I hope causes us to check our love of stuff. And while we may not be able to control everything about everywhere, about how necessarily everything is produced, sometimes a mindfulness in some of those things isn't the worst thing in the world. And yes, I want a good deal as much as anybody. And I want to save money as much as anybody. Right? And no, it's impossible to do that, I think, personally, from every little thing. But if we know of certain things, we can make, I think, incredible and wise and, frankly, godly decisions instead of perpetuating aspects of injustice in our world simply for our pocketbook. But y'all, it doesn't take John to tell us that what we think about our money matters to God. If somebody would read 1 Timothy 6, 9 through 10, because by the way, what we're talking about here is no different than what Paul told Timothy to preach and teach. By the way, to Ephesus, one of the churches, by the way, one of the wealthiest cities in the Roman Empire. So remember, these words are spoken to one of these churches struggling with this materialism in 1 Timothy. If somebody would, please read verses 6 through 9 for me.
But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into any senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pains.
Of course, it's not money itself. That's what every preacher has to say, so that people don't get off, get on his back and ride too hard, right? But y'all don't minimize this, because sometimes we say out loud, right? Well, it's the love of money, not money itself. Yeah, but you better think and know how dangerous it can be, right? Guns don't kill people. People kill people. All right? I don't know how to tell you this. Guns are pretty stinking dangerous, though. Okay? The same thing goes for money. The same thing goes for money. Be mindful of how we think about it. If somebody would keep reading, please. Verse 17 and 19 for me.
As for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life.
Thank you, brother. Just like all dangerous things in the world, y'all, we got to be mindful. It's not a flippant thing to treat dangerous things as if they're not. All right? And that's the point that I'm trying to make. And even Jesus himself said, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot, what did Jesus say? Some of you can't. Wait. But God, I think I can. You cannot serve God. Jesus didn't say throw it all away. Set it all on fire. But remember who your God is. And Revelation echoes that reality of how dangerous it can be. And then in a small way, verses 17 through 19, you find the seafarers and the sea merchants in that same regard. Right? The vital importance of commerce and communication for the Roman Empire traveled by sea. And the largest and grandest cities were often seaports. By the way, same throughout history. Ezekiel 27:30, Revelation 13:4, the mourning and the pouring on dust on their head is a form of mourning. And so those seafarers had a significant hand in the exploitation and injustice. Those goods got there somewhere. There were middlemen in between those merchants and those places. And so here, that's why, if you're wondering, well, why did these sea captains catch strays, so to speak, from Paul's preaching? Or excuse me, not Paul, but John's vision. And it was because, well, they were the middleman that got those goods to those places. And they had a hand in frankly being called out as well. And so what we need to know is that God considers not only what people do, but also who and what they condone, benefit from, and cooperate with is part of his judgment. Y'all, there are sins of commission and omission. If I were to ask how we can combat this today, I think mindfulness would be key. One of the commentators, Duvall, said, while complex, complexity does not excuse total avoidance of the issue. I like that line. Are these things complex? Yeah, they are. But does it mean we get to avoid them just because they're complex? And the answer is no. Be faithful in small ways that restrict our discipleship to only religious areas. Don't think that our faith only applies to church stuff. Understanding economics, by the way, isn't the worst thing either. And ultimately, you find this morning a funeral service that then turns into a worship service. And with my time so we can go enjoy outside, I need to wrap it up.
Cut!
So there we go. That's a wrap. Any questions, comments, side remarks? Miss Taryn's there. They may have words.
It's going real well this morning, and I know your class